in this session, we're going to focus on Christianity in Southern Africa. Where we ended off in the previous session, we saw or learned that in the 7th century, that's where things started getting difficult, and the spread of Christianity actually stopped while it was still in North Africa. So there was a gap in terms of time, and now we focusing on Southern Africa, where we are right now. So starting again with Acts 1 verse 8, it's good to get our bearings right. So it says, "But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in all Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth." So in Southern Africa, again, we are part of the ends of the earth. Again, no coincidence that Christianity is in Southern Africa. It was always part of the plan. So just a recap, and as we transition, so we saw that things stopped in the 7th century in North Africa, and the spread of Christianity resumed in the 15th century. Now, southwards, with the arrival of the Portuguese, when they came to explore Africa. And there was, I guess, the leader of that exploration, Prince Henry, known as the Navigator. So he was the first European to come and explore Africa. So with that, there's this concept of colonialism in Africa. We've probably heard about it. And so what is it about? So over time, other European countries, other European powers came because there was so much. Africa is rich in natural resources. Africa is rich in minerals. Probably with what he was exporting, those other European powers saw an opportunity for themselves to come and also explore. Because, I mean, the continent is massive. But other powers were also interested in slave trade. So Christianity in Southern Africa is more about pain. It's painful than what happened in the earlier centuries in North Africa. So, with the rush of European powers to Africa, there was a stampede, and they started fighting amongst each other for resources. So the Portuguese were the first to come. Then the Dutch came. In South Africa in particular, you'll remember from history that in 1652, Jan van Riebeeck arrived with Dutch East Indian Company, and took over certain parts of the country. So the Dutch came with the Reformed Protestant churches and introduced, we know Dutch Reformed Church. The British came with Anglican Church, and the Scots came with Calvinism. So it's economy and mission Christianity together. So in the 19th century, there was a lot of active work being done, or that was done on the continent. And missionaries, those who were preaching the gospel, at the same time were exploring the continent economically. And colonialism and the spread of Christianity, known as missionary Christianity, occurred side by side. They mutually impacted in each other and they benefited from each other. We'll talk about that later. And so it got to a point where now they began fighting among themselves. So to resolve this conflict, they decided that there must be a conference back in Europe to resolve this issue. So they had a conference called the Berlin Conference. If you Google it, you'll get more details about it. In 1884, that's the 19th century, the sole aim of that was to resolve the conflict on the African continent. So what you have is, if you Google it and select images, you will see, and I think that's probably the correct depiction of what happened. A group of men sitting around the table with a map of Africa, and each country choosing which one they want. Yeah. And so they basically decided, okay, who's going to take over or explore which country? And they came up with, so there were four main outcomes from that conference. One was to share the countries, and two, to formalize this arrangement with an act they called the General Act of Berlin, and thirdly, to end slavery. And with that, they introduced what is called, or they formalized what's called the 3 C's, not Raj's 3 C's. Commerce, because that was the main purpose they are in Africa, or were in Africa to begin with. So formalize that. Christianity as well, the spread of Christianity and civilization. So with them exploring how do they improve the lives of Africans in areas or countries they're in. So that was the conference they had. And the outcome is this. That's why we have English-speaking countries, Portuguese-speaking countries, French-speaking countries. That's how we arrived at this. So this background it's important, in fact crucial, critical, so that when people talk about colonialism, the pain that came with it, because our great-grandparents lived through this I mean, 1884 is not far off. So you're talking great-grandfathers. So that's not far back. So yeah, so the spread of Christianity in Southern Africa was accompanied by pain. So as we evangelize, as we talk to people and they express some of this, so we must understand where it comes from, because other people still haven't moved from this. And African countries gained independence not so long ago. I think Zimbabwe was 1980, I think, and the last one was Namibia, I think in 93. South Africa was with democracy, but I think it was in 1990, yeah, and we had the elections later in 94. So this is it's recent history, so still very much fresh in people's memories. So and this will also impact on us, or this generation that need to spread the gospel. And so this is what happened in the 19th century. So Europeans went, had their conference, came back, and now they colonized the continent. So how did the locals respond? Particularly from a spiritual or Christianity point of view. So locals responded at least in 4 ways. The first one was in the form of African independent churches, AICs, different from African initiated churches. So African independent churches are the African versions of missionary churches. So the missionary churches are like the Anglican Church, Methodist Church, Dutch Reformed Church, and so forth. So what some did, because the missionaries evangelized and people were converted, or people became members of these churches. And so what then happened with the African independent churches is that some felt that they are losing touch with their Africanness, and they would still like to practice some of their or participate in some of their practices. And with this, they were allowed. And then they formed, you can see, like Presbyterian Church of Africa. So this is like the African version. So the doctrine is Presbyterian Church's doctrine, but then they are allowed. That's where now the discussion we had earlier. So you have the doctrine from Presbyterian Church, but you are allowed to fully participate in African culture. So now you have a combination. So these African independent churches, there's those where syncretism is allowed. The practice or beliefs of two or more. So that was the first response. And this approach, because in South Africa later then apartheid kicked in. So this approach fueled apartheid, because now you could have Afrikaans churches in urban areas or in towns, then this African version churches in the townships. So there was, now it made it easier for segregation, to segregate people along racial lines. So the second way that Africans responded was in the form of AICs, African Initiated Churches. These are churches that are founded by Africans. They are not based on anything that was taught. If you look at the Old Testament, some regulations, a lot of regulations given in the Old Testament to the Israelites are similar to African traditional practices. There's a lot of similarities. So these churches are largely based on the Old Testament. They follow that more than the New Testament, because for them it makes it easier and actually justify why they should follow or continue with African traditional religions or practices and cultures as part of the church. And these churches, and the way they are founded, they are self-financing, self-governing, because they are not tied to any other church. And with this type of churches, you have like one main leader, deciding what happens to the rest of the church. So the biggest is the ZCC, with millions of members, and the second biggest is Nazareth Baptist, known as Shembe. These are the two biggest churches that fall under African initiated churches, and each country has this type of churches. So that's the second way that Africans responded to mission Christianity. And the third was in the form of Ethiopian churches. Now, what we were discussing earlier, they have their own Bible, which is similar to ours, but theirs, they've added a few. There's other books, and if you go to that website, Early Christian Writings, you will find these books. Enoch, Apocrypha, and Apocrypha is it's a whole lot of other books, and so the thing with Ethiopian churches, if we go back, one thing I should have mentioned is on this map, there are two countries that were never colonized. Ethiopia and
what's that country down there?
it's Libya. Yeah. So two countries that were never colonized. So
Why was that?
I would say it's more to do, I know from Ethiopia, they fought to the extent that things just never got there. Lesotho is British. Mm. Or was. Didn't? Okay. So the case of Ethiopian churches is very interesting because they were never colonized. There was a belief, or why people like the Ethiopian church is that because they were never colonized and people have an issue with Christianity that was brought by the Europeans. That's where the saying that Christianity is a Western religion comes from what we just discussed now. But because Ethiopia was never colonized, so other Africans believe, actually, because we've seen even in the previous session we had, that Ethiopia was there, or Christianity in Ethiopia was there from the 1st century. And because it was never colonized, so then the Christianity in Ethiopia is undiluted. So others feel, okay, so it's still, not to say it's still original, or what was there in the 1st century, but those who have an issue with the Christianity that was brought by European would opt for this Ethiopian Orthodox Copts, because we spoke about the split in the 5th century. So Egypt and Ethiopia split to one side, and the rest, those who believe in incarnation, were another group. So now these Europeans are the ones who brought this Christianity to Southern Africa. So the Egyptian and Ethiopian was the other group. So that's why they have their own Bible, their own canon, and it looks different to us. Yes. So that's why our Bible differs from theirs. So these Ethiopian churches, and I think there are Ethiopian churches, they are actually in South Africa. So that's what makes them attractive. And another way that we've touched on this already, so it's spiritual or prophet healing churches. We spoke about witchcraft, we spoke about evil, and speaking of tongues, because where there's witchcraft, where there's evil, people are after healing, miracles. So this type of churches we discussed in the previous session became popular. That's why they are popular, because there the belief is that you will find healing. And the issue of speaking of tongues, we spoke about it at length. So it makes you feel like, you are connecting to God. And we spoke about emotionalism. That's what they sell in these churches. You go to a worship service on Sunday. When you are there, you feel emotionally connected, because that's what African worship, or even African singing, it's about. It gets you, emotionally engaged, and that's what people are after. That's why these churches are popular. So in South Africa in particular, as I mentioned, when we were discussing African independent churches. So in 1948, when the apartheid system was introduced, so it made it easier to segregate people along racial lines, because churches were already structured that way. So you had the Afrikaner churches providing the theology to the township churches, and later in the 70s, and we know what happened in Soweto in 1976. So with Africans, they were encouraged to participate in the struggle, because that was seen as part of freedom. So as we conclude this session, I think one interesting thing about Christianity is that it adapts to, and I think going back to Jesus' words in Act 1 verse 8, where he says, "You'll be my witnesses in all these places." Surely God knew that in all these places there's different cultures, but also Revelation does say, talk about people from all languages, all tribes, and so forth. So there was always going to be a challenge when Christianity spreads to different places. But what should be comforting to us is that Christianity is an adaptable faith. It can adapt. And even Paul does say it, saying that I become all things to all men. And and again, another interesting fact is that initially, Europe had more Christians than other places or other continents. But now, other continents, Asia and Africa in particular, there has been a growth of Christianity, but in Europe and in America, actually Christianity is declining. And it is believed that in the next 50 years, Africa will be the global center of Christianity. And actually now, there's something called reverse mission. So, because initially you had the Europeans coming to Africa to introduce Christianity. Now you have Africans going to Europe to preach the gospel. You have Africans going to America to preach the gospel. It's called a reverse mission. So I like to close off with this map, which is I think sobering. If you look at, so the yellow is areas where Christianity is declining. If you look at North America and South America, you can see what's happening there. And I would say brown is where there's growth. Look at Africa. Light brown, that is. So South Africa, Central Africa, basically Sub-Saharan Africa, there's still growth. But if you look at North Africa, where it all started. It's dark brown, significant decline. Yeah, I guess that's, yes, that's the main contribution. So look at North America, South America, Australia, and yeah. So with this, is it, what does this mean? Is it surprising, just reflecting on this map, is it surprising that we have these areas or continents where there's decline and others there's still potential for growth? And secondly, and linked to that, what does it mean for you and I? What does this knowledge, how does this knowledge help us going forward?